Richard Dawkins, some years ago now, wrote a book called The God Delusion. In that book he presents his elaborate case against the existence of God. Along the way he spends several pages taking St. Thomas Aquinas' arguments for the existence of God and criticizing them. He doesn't spend a lot of time on those arguments. He spends about 3 pages on them. And I use these 3 pages in a class that I teach that focuses on Augustine and Aquinas. And I spend a significant amount of time talking about a few of Aquinas' arguments. We're not able to cover all of them, but I'll spend, probably on average 2 or 3 weeks talking about 1 or 2 of these arguments. The reason why I mention that is because that shows you that the arguments are really more complex than you might think. There's a lot more implied in them. One of the problems with reading Aquinas for many people is that Aquinas is writing for teachers, people who are going to present this material, and he is purposely writing in a very concise way. That means that when you look at Aquinas, when you read his text, it is sometimes almost deceptively short because it seems to imply that there's not a whole lot to say about it, when in fact Aquinas is summarizing things that are very, very complex, and there's a whole lot to say about them. Aquinas assumes that teachers of the material will understand it enough that they can explain what Aquinas is describing and what he is wanting you to see. Now, when Dawkins summarizes Aquinas' arguments, he does them in a very brief way, and he takes the first 3 arguments of Aquinas and reduces them to just a few sentences for each argument. For example, the first one, which is Aquinas' argument for motion, and that's the one that I want to concentrate on here for a few moments with you. His argument for motion, Dawkins summarizes it this way: nothing moves without a prior mover. This leads us to a regress, from which the only escape is God. Something had to make the first move, and that's something we call God. Now, the summary here, I think, is way too short to really do justice to what Aquinas is saying. So let me see if I can take a stab at it very quickly and tell you just in very general terms how the argument works. This is not intended to be a thorough defense of the argument, just to make some observations about it. First of all, Aquinas thinks that the argument from motion, and what he means by motion is simply any actualization of possibility. When anything that can be actually comes to be. When anything that can be but is not yet actually comes to be, you have an instance of motion. That could be moving something from point A to point B, like I move my hand from here to here, that's an instance of motion. But any other sort of actualization of possibility is also a motion. Like, for instance, if right now I'm thinking one thought, but in a few seconds I'll be thinking another thought, that's another instance of motion. When something comes to be that wasn't before, even if it doesn't involve local motion or movement from one place to the other, it's still some type of becoming or something coming to happen or coming to be. Now, Aquinas argues and reasons that anything that comes to be that wasn't before has to be actualized or moved by something that's in a state of actuality. Now, this is very simply means that something cannot come from nothing. That when a possibility is actualized, the possibility itself is really nothing until it comes to be actualized by other real causes. Take, for example, an apple seed. If I look at an apple seed, it is potentially an apple tree. Now, that potential of being a tree is not really an actuality. The tree is not there. The potential of the tree is there because there's a seed that has within it a certain possibility of growing into a tree. But the only way that's going to grow into a tree is if there are some moving causes. In this case, there has to be soil, there has to be moisture, there has to be sunlight, and all of these things combine together to move the seed into becoming an actual tree. If you never put that seed in soil, if you never give it moisture, if you never give it sunlight, that potentiality will never be actualized. So you have to have actual soil, actual sunlight, actual moisture in order for the seed to become a real tree. That's simply the point that Aquinas is making, is that when possible things become actual, that only happens under the influence of something that's actual. Something has to be real to cause a motion or a change. Now, if you accept that principle, and I think that principle is not only sort of intuitively obvious to anyone that observes the world around us, but also I think that it's metaphysically necessary. In this sense, what I mean by metaphysical is that there are certain principles that must be true, they must hold true, in order for any of our thinking to be sound. And one of those principles is that nothing cannot be the explanation of something. And what I mean by nothing is the absence of being altogether. that there must be something there in order to bring about something else or some other change. Now, let's think about this for a moment. If a potential tree becomes an actual tree, that's because there was real soil, a real seed, real sunlight that brought about that motion or that actualization of possibility. Now, if you see that, the next question that we would ask is, once we have come to understand why there's a tree because there were actual causes that move that seed into a state of actually being a tree. If you see that point, then the next question that might arise is, then what is the cause of the actuality of the sunlight or of the soil or of the seed? Now, if we look at the seed, for instance, and we say the seed is its own explanation. There is no need to ask about the origin of the seed. There's no reason to inquire further into where the seed came from. The seed simply is. If that explanation is satisfactory to us, if that truly answers all the questions that need to be asked, then we're finished with our investigation. The seed is an eternal, self-existent, uncaused reality. However, if we recognize that that is an insufficient explanation of the seed, and I think we all do, for various reasons. We know that seeds come from apples, and apples in turn have to be actualized by a tree in which they are produced as fruit. So because we know the nature of a seed, the seed is destructible, the seed is finite, the seed depends upon various other things. Because we know that the seed does not have the sort of attributes or qualities that we would expect in a self-existent, necessary, uncaused reality, our minds then go on to another cause or reason or explanation of the actuality of the seed. Now, if you see that, that then leads us to a kind of regress of causal explanations. And that's what Dawkins is referring to here, is that when Aquinas looks at the world and tries to understand something about it, what happens is the mind, as long as we are confronted with things that do not fully account for what we see or what we observe, our minds are pushed into a regress or a series of dependent explanations that in turn depend upon some other prior explanation. Aquinas' point then is this, that if we find ourselves in the presence of a world that is becoming, that shows us that it is coming to be from states of potentiality to actuality, if we find ourselves and discover that that is a feature of the world, then our mind gets caught up in this search for understanding. It belongs to human nature to look for understanding, to look for reasons for things. And so as the mind is prompted into curiosity and to wonder and to investigation, we find ourselves in a world of regressing explanations. That is, explanations that lead us to other explanations, that lead us to other explanations. Now, Aquinas reasons that this cannot go on to infinity. Why not? Well, it cannot go on to infinity because to give an endless or infinite number of answers to a question, none of which completely answer the question, leaves you with an incomplete answer. In other words, to say forever that we don't have a full explanation of something and then say, well, this explains that, but it doesn't fully explain itself, to have an infinite number of incomplete answers still leaves you with an incomplete answer. Furthermore, and let me offer you this, furthermore, you can't have an infinite number of dependent causes, especially in terms of causes upon which a present event depends right here and now. Like right here and now, I'm only able to exist and function because of a gravitational relationship between me and the planet, or with the oxygen that I'm able to breathe, or the energy that my body is using right now in order to move, and so on. If not for those various factors, I couldn't talk, I couldn't do anything, I couldn't exist. Those things have to exist right here and now in order for me to have this presentation or talk about these things. Now, what Aquinas argues is that you can't have an infinite number of simultaneously dependent causal relationships for a present event. Because if you have an infinite number of essentially preconditions for a present effect, like right now, if my speaking the next word that comes out of my mouth depends on an infinite number of dependent causal relationships going on forever, or simultaneously infinite number of things have to happen. If that's the case, then we would never get to the next word that I speak. That's a very, very important point, that if an infinite number of preconditions for the next word that comes out of my mouth, if an infinite number of things have to happen or an infinite number of preconditions have to be satisfied, then I could not possibly utter the next word out of my mouth, precisely because an infinite number never comes to an end, or an infinite series never comes to an end. So if an infinite number of things have to happen before I can say a word, then I never say a word, because you can never finish the infinite number of preconditions for this moment. Now, if you see the power of that point, which is a very important one to Aquinas' arguments, if you see the power of that point, then the conclusion follows from that the number of things upon which this moment depend cannot be truly infinite in number. There has to be a finite number of dependent relationships, causal relationships, upon which this moment depends. And that finite number means there has to be an end. There has to be a final, supreme explanation of this moment. And that supreme final explanation would have to be self-explanatory. If it's not self-explanatory, then that means we've only reverted back to the regress of insufficient explanations for this moment. Aquinas draws the conclusion then that there must be a first, self-explained, eternal, uncaused reason for all of the becoming or motions that characterize the world of our experience. And that's the gist, or that's the essence of the first argument of Aquinas. In our next presentation, I will show you how Dawkins seeks to undermine this argument or to reject this argument. I think what you'll find as I present the argument, or Dawkins' response to it, is that Dawkins fundamentally misunderstands Aquinas' argument. But I'll save that for the next presentation.